A white judge smirks as he mocks a black attorney in his courtroom, until she pulls out one piece of evidence that leaves him speechless. The grand courtroom hummed with a low murmur, a symphony of whispers, rustling papers, and the occasional clack of polished shoes against the marble floor. High, arched windows lined the chamber, allowing pale streams of morning light to pour in, casting elongated shadows over the mahogany benches. The scent of aged books and fresh ink lingered in the air, mingling with the quiet tension of expectation. Lawyers moved with practiced confidence, adjusting their ties, smoothing their jackets, and casting measured glances toward the jury. Clerks shuffled stacks of documents, their movements brisk and precise, each detail a cog in the massive machine of justice. Spectators filled the rows behind the legal teams, some whispering in hushed voices, others waiting in silence, anticipation thick in the air. At the center of it all stood Danielle Carter. She was poised, unmoving, her dark brown eyes scanning the room with a quiet, deliberate intensity. She exuded the kind of confidence that was hard-earned, built from years of relentless study, countless sleepless nights, and battles fought in courtrooms just like this one. But today was different. Today wasn't just another case. Today was a defining moment. This was a high-profile civil rights case, one that could set a precedent, one that could change lives. Danielle adjusted her suit jacket, a tailored navy ensemble that framed her slender but strong figure. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself. The weight of history rested on her shoulders, but she did not falter. She had fought too hard, sacrificed too much, to let nerves get the better of her now. Then, the heavy door at the front of the courtroom swung open. Judge William Lancaster entered, and the room shifted. Conversations dimmed, lawyers straightened, even the most casual of spectators sat upright. Judge Lancaster was a man of reputation, a seasoned legal mind, sharp, ruthless, and notoriously biased. He was an old-school traditionalist, the kind who believed certain people belonged in certain places, and others did not. His rulings often leaned in favor of those who looked like him, white, wealthy, and connected. And today, Danielle could already see it in the smirk tugging at the corner of his thin lips. As he settled into his seat, he gave her a slow once-over, eyes sweeping from her face to the files in her hands, then back up again. His fingers drummed against the polished wooden desk in front of him, the sound a steady, deliberate beat that felt almost mocking. Then, he tapped his gavel. A sharp, authoritative crack echoed through the chamber. Silence fell over the room like a heavy blanket, and then, in a voice dripping with condescension, he spoke. "Miss Carter," he drawled, "are you sure you're in the right courtroom?" The words landed like a slap. A ripple of amusement flickered through the audience. The opposing counsel smirked, leaning back in his chair, enjoying the moment. A few low chuckles echoed in the back rows, poorly concealed. Danielle didn't flinch. She had expected this. She had prepared for this. Her grip on her case files tightened, but her expression remained unreadable. She met the judge's gaze head-on, refusing to shrink under his scrutiny. This wasn't the first time she had been underestimated. It would not be the last. And before the day was over, they would all learn exactly who Danielle Carter was. Danielle Carter stood firm, her posture unwavering, but beneath her poised exterior, a slow fire simmered. Her fingers tightened around her case files, the cool, smooth edges pressing into her palm like a reminder. Stay sharp, stay steady. This wasn't new. She had fought these battles before. The weight of prejudice was familiar. As she moved toward the bench, she could feel the judge's gaze burrowing into her, dissecting her piece by piece, searching for any flaw, any sign of weakness. His scrutiny wasn't professional. It was personal. Judge Lancaster barely concealed his disdain. It wasn't just in his expression. It was in his posture, the casual way he leaned back in his chair as though already exhausted by the mere thought of her presence. It was in the tap of his gavel, sharp and impatient. It was in the way his lips curled in amusement before he even spoke. Danielle had prepared for this moment with meticulous precision. had spent countless nights poring over evidence, refining every word of her argument. But as she opened her mouth to begin her opening statement, he cut her off. "Let's keep this brief," Judge Lancaster said, waving a dismissive hand as if swatting away a nuisance. "We don't need theatrics today." The words were deliberate, barbed. The message was clear. He saw her as nothing more than a disruption, an inconvenience. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, low but potent. Across the room, the opposing counsel, a seasoned attorney named Charles. Whitmore, smug and comfortable in his status, sat back in his chair, smirking. He folded his hands together, watching with undisguised amusement as the judge openly dismissed her. To him, this was a performance, a predictable unraveling of an attorney who didn't belong in this arena. His silver cufflinks glinted in the light as he turned slightly to glance at the jury, gauging their reactions. Danielle took a measured breath, resisting the urge to glance their way, but she could feel it, the shift in the room, the doubt settling in. Some of the jury members exchanged glances, uncertain, skeptical. A few furrowed their brows, while others looked as though they had already made up their minds before she had spoken a single word. It was a trial by silent judgment. Danielle knew exactly what they were thinking. Does she really know what she's doing? Maybe the judge is right, maybe this will be a waste of time. Is she just trying to make a point, or does she actually have a case? Doubt was a powerful weapon, and Judge Lancaster had just wielded it against her with a single sentence. The courtroom was a battlefield, and before a single argument had been made, they were already questioning whether she had the right to stand here. But Danielle Carter had spent her entire life proving people wrong, and she wasn't about to stop now. She tightened her grip on her case files, steadied her voice, and met the judge's gaze head-on. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she said smoothly, "justice isn't served by rushing to conclusions. I intend to present my case thoroughly, and I believe the court deserves nothing less." A flicker of something, annoyance, amusement, passed through the judge's eyes. Whitmore let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head as though indulging a child who didn't know when to quit. But Danielle didn't care about their opinions. She had the truth on her side. And before this trial was over, they would all know it. Danielle Carter adjusted the microphone before her hands steady, her spine unyielding. The weight of the courtroom bore down on her, but she was used to it. With a measured breath, she presented her first piece of evidence. "Your Honor, Exhibit A," she said, her voice carrying through the high ceilings of the courtroom. "Surveillance footage from the night in question which directly contradicts the plaintiff's claim." A loud, exaggerated sigh interrupted her. "Judge." Lancaster leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple as if she had personally given him a headache. He turned slightly, addressing the opposing counsel before she could finish her sentence. "Ms. Carter, is this really relevant?" he said, his tone drenched in manufactured boredom. "Let's not waste the jury's time with unnecessary theatrics." Danielle's jaw tightened, but she refused to let the irritation show. It was a tactic, one she had seen before: undermine, belittle, dismiss. If he could make her seem unprepared, if he could paint her arguments as flimsy, then doubt would seep into the jury before she even had a chance to build momentum. She clasped her hands together, meeting the judge's gaze. "Not today, Your Honor," she said evenly. "This footage directly refutes the prosecution's claims. I believe the jury has the right to see it." A flicker of annoyance crossed Lancaster's face, but he waved his hand in reluctant approval. "Fine. Proceed." Danielle signaled to the bailiff, who brought the footage up on the courtroom's monitor. The screen flickered to life, and the room grew still. The first few seconds of grainy security footage played. The plaintiff had testified under oath that they were not present at the location that evening. Yet, there they were, in crystal clear clarity, stepping out of a vehicle. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Danielle turned slightly, observing the jury's reaction, curiosity, doubt, a crack in the prosecution's narrative. But before she could elaborate, all right, Lancaster interrupted again, waving dismissively. That's enough. Let's move on. Danielle exhaled slowly through her nose. Actually, Your Honor, I'd like to point out— Ms. Carter, Lancaster interrupted sharply. I believe we've heard enough on this particular piece of evidence. Unless you have something groundbreaking, let's not drag this out. A few soft chuckles came from the audience. Mockery, again. But Danielle wasn't laughing. She had anticipated this. Every interruption, every condescending remark, every attempt to rush her along as if her words held less weight than her opponent's. She refused to be silenced. One by one, she laid out her arguments, building them like a carefully constructed bridge. Each fact, linking to the next, solid, undeniable. The judge interrupted her. She pressed forward. The opposing counsel smirked. She sharpened her tone, a war of persistence. At first, the audience had laughed along with the judge's dismissiveness. But now, they were listening. Slowly, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. The murmurs of disinterest turned into hushed anticipation. Some of the jury members leaned forward in their seats, their pens poised over their notepads. A woman in the second row, who had initially seemed unimpressed, now furrowed her brows in thought. Even Charles Whitmore, the opposing counsel, seemed to sense the change. The smirk on his face had faded ever so slightly, his once relaxed posture now stiffening as Danielle continued dismantling his case, piece by irrefutable piece. And for the first time since the trial had begun, Judge Lancaster looked uncomfortable. Danielle glanced briefly at the monitor, then back at the judge, her voice unwavering. Your Honor, I have more evidence to present. And this time, when Lancaster sighed and waved her forward, it wasn't with dismissal. It was with reluctant acknowledgement. Danielle Carter took a steady breath as she reached for the final piece of evidence. The weight of the courtroom had shifted. The smirks were gone, replaced with silence so thick it clung to the walls. She had them now. Your Honor, she said, lifting a crisp document from her stack of files. I'd like to introduce Exhibit D into evidence, a signed affidavit that I believe will prove beyond a doubt that the prosecution's case is built on a fundamental lie. The opposing attorney, Charles Whitmore, who had lounged confidently in his chair just moments ago, stiffened. His hands twitched as he reached for his notes, flipping through them with a sudden urgency. He had missed something. The jury stirred, eyes darting from Danielle to the judge, anticipation thick in the air. Judge Lancaster, who had spent the entire trial treating Danielle with thinly veiled condescension, narrowed his eyes. He tapped his gavel once, his voice tight. Ms. Carter, I hope you're not wasting the court's time with last-minute dramatics. Danielle met his gaze evenly, refusing to shrink under his scrutiny. On the contrary, Your Honor, this document will expose a direct contradiction in the plaintiff's testimony. She turned, walking toward the evidence display, placing the document under the projector's light. The screen illuminated with crisp black text. An official statement, dated and signed. This is an affidavit from a key witness who was never called to the stand. This witness, a former employee of the plaintiff, provided a sworn statement that directly contradicts the plaintiff's claims. It states that on the night in question, the plaintiff was not where they claimed to be. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. The jury sat forward in their seats. Whitmore's face had gone pale. He shot a quick glance toward his client, who shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Objection, Whitmore blurted, rising to his feet. His voice, once so smooth and full of arrogance, now carried an edge of desperation. This document was not included in discovery. Danielle didn't even blink. Overruled, Lancaster said gruffly. The room turned sharply toward the judge. He had spent the entire trial throwing up roadblocks, dismissing her arguments, treating her as though she were an inexperienced attorney who had stumbled into his courtroom by mistake. But now, even he couldn't ignore what was in front of him. His lips pressed into a thin line, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the bench. He wasn't looking at Danielle anymore. He was looking at the evidence, and for the first time, he was speechless. Danielle continued, her voice unwavering. Your Honor, This affidavit was legally obtained and submitted through the proper channels. It proves that the plaintiff knowingly provided false testimony under oath. This changes everything. Gasps. Someone in the gallery whispered a stunned, "Oh my God." Whitmore, still standing, opened his mouth, then closed it. There was nothing he could say. Danielle turned to the jury. Their eyes were locked on her, no longer seeing just a young black attorney fighting against a system stacked against her. They saw the truth, and suddenly, all the sneers, all the dismissive glances, all the laughter from the start of the trial, none of it mattered anymore. Danielle Carter had just turned the case on its head, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The courtroom was silent. Judge William Lancaster adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable. The gavel sat heavy in his grasp, motionless, as if he were stalling the inevitable. His lips pressed into a thin line before he finally exhaled, through his nose, and spoke. After careful consideration of the evidence presented, the court finds in favor of the defense. The case is dismissed. A sharp, stunned gasp rippled through the gallery. Danielle Carter remained still for a moment, letting the weight of those words settle in the air. Then, slowly, she straightened her shoulders. She had won, not just the case, but the respect of an entire courtroom. The plaintiff, the man who had spent the entire trial smugly assuming victory, now slumped in his seat, his face pale. The opposing attorney, Charles Whitmore, clenched his jaw so tightly it looked as if his teeth might crack. His knuckles were white where they gripped the table. And then there was Judge Lancaster, the man who had all but scoffed at Danielle when she first walked into his courtroom. The man who had belittled her, interrupted her, and dismissed her arguments at every turn, now sat there defeated by the very woman he had underestimated. Clearing his throat, he squared his shoulders. His pride wouldn't let him show the full depth of his discomfort, but there was something different in his voice when he spoke again. "Ms. Carter," he said, forcing himself to meet her gaze. His tone, though still gruff, lacked the condescension it once held. "Well argued." The words were stiff, begrudging, but they carried a weight that had not been there before. Danielle held his gaze for a beat, then simply nodded. She didn't smirk. She didn't gloat. She didn't need his approval. Her success, her work, her undeniable talent, that was all the validation she would ever need. As Danielle gathered her files, she felt the eyes of the courtroom on her. The same people who had laughed at the judge's mockery, the same people who had doubted her ability the moment. They saw her skin color, the same people who had assumed this trial was already decided before it even began. "Now," they whispered in admiration. A reporter scribbled notes furiously, already crafting tomorrow's headline. A younger black attorney in the back of the courtroom sat a little taller, his eyes alight with something close to awe. One of the jurors, a woman who had seemed skeptical at the start of the trial, offered Danielle a small, respectful nod. She had proven that skill, perseverance, and intelligence would always rise above prejudice. As Danielle made her way toward the courtroom doors, her heels echoed against the marble floor, each step a declaration of victory. Whitmore refused to look at her. The judge had already shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Their world had been shaken today. But Danielle? She was already looking ahead. The courtroom doors swung open, and she stepped through them without hesitation. The camera lingers on her figure, strong, unshaken, resolute. She doesn't stop. She doesn't look back. Because this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning.